Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome, brothers and sisters. Welcome, my friends, to a brand new video. My name is Arfat, and today we're going to be discussing a brief history of the books of Samuel and the book of Kings. I'm approaching this from the Hebrew Bible perspective, meaning the book of Kings is a whole. Um, but then again, I'll make distinctions between where does the prophet lies and things like that. All right. So to be very brief, the book of Samuel and the book of Kings they happen around before the Babylonian conquest as well as before the Assyrian conquest in 722 BCE. Time span, timeline wise, according to most scholars, probably around the time of David as well as before David, when Samuel was the last of the great kings, probably around the time of 1050 BCE, also about 400-year history, okay? 300 to 400-year history, depending on which timeline you follow. Um, and so the book of Samuel begins with Samuel becoming the last of the great judges. Okay, remember after Moses and after Joshua, when Joshua brought people to the promised land, Moses never entered the promised land. He never crossed the other side of the Jordan. And Joshua, he actually mimics Moses when Moses took people to cross the Red Sea. According to some scholars, it is the Sea of Reeds, and according to some scholars, it is the Red Sea. Whichever interpretation you take, it doesn't affect our discussion here. And so these are all part of the Deuteronomistic history. Okay, the Deuteronomistic history is beyond the concept of this video. I'll refer you to the works of Joel Baden, or read Introduction to the Hebrew Bible by John Collins. And Fortress Press has a book published called Introduction to the Torah as well, and so you can read these books as well. If you do not know what the Deuteronomistic historian really is, then I would say that look it up first, because that will give you a background context for you to understand this video. So the book of Samuel, the book of Kings, as well as the book of Judges, according to a lot of there are disputes, okay, but according to majority of the historians, Friedman, for example, Richard Elliot Friedman, a lot of these are all strong Jewish scholars. They agree that majority of these books were probably written by the Deuteronomistic historian. Okay, the Deuteronomistic historian probably writes around the year 500 to 400 or so. When they look back, okay, they wrote a different history, because if you look at the Torah, okay, the Torah is Genesis, okay, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The Deuteronomy section comes later on, about 800 years later, or 600 to 800 years later. Okay, the roots of the first four books, Genesis to Numbers, okay, take place around the year 1000 or 800, or probably slightly before that. Okay, this is in BCE. The book of Deuteronomy came much later on. Okay, and that is why if you look at Deuteronomy, it portrays a different story. If you compare it to the first four books, as well as the Chronicles. Okay, the chroniclers was probably writing 400 years also before the Common Era, before Jesus. Okay, and because if you read the book of Samuel and Kings, especially the story on David and Solomon, you find that 1 and 2 Chronicles, using the Christian Old Testament here, it portrays a slightly different story of David and Solomon. If you open your mind and you read, actually, Samuel and Kings, David and Solomon was portrayed as the chosen one of God, but their reign comes with a lot of personal problems as well. I will not mention it because I do not believe that both David and Solomon were this type of people. But the things that they do, these quote unquote bad things that they do, is not mentioned by the chroniclers. And so a lot of scholars believe that the chroniclers probably had with them a different history, a different interpretation of history, or probably different writings of history that differs from the Deuteronomistic historian, and that they have come and they disagree with the Deuteronomistic historian when it comes to the story of David and when it comes to the story of Solomon, so on and so forth. Okay? The Deuteronomistic historian in the book of Deuteronomy is also basically a different school of thought, comparing it to the first four books, okay, the Yahweh source, as well as the Elohim source. The chroniclers is a C source, is a different source. Again, that is another. It's too complicated to explain here. But to go back to our topic, to summarize the book of Samuel begins with, I need to go back to the book of Judges before that to give you a background context. So when Moses do not enter the promised land, Joshua mimics Moses by crossing the Jordan, same way as Moses crosses the Sea of Reeds. And a lot of things happen, the falling of the wall of Jericho, so on and so forth. But Joshua wasn't considered like a prophet according to some Jewish interpretation. He is considered the first great judge according to some Jewish interpretation or Jewish scholars. Again, these are all in disputes, and there's no certainty to this. So take whatever opinion you accept. But let's just presume here that Joshua was again, I believe Joshua was a prophet. Okay, Yeshua, he was a prophet. Yoyusha, he was a prophet. But again, let's just take the interpretation here that he was the first of the great judges, okay, or pre-judges. Let's just call it that, okay, because this is in the realm of uncertainty. Historians, there are strong consensus of historians, but again, this is still in the lines of debate, okay. And so as layperson, we just have to take whichever scholars that we accept, and there's no strong opinions to this as well. And so let's summarize the book of Judges. So Israel was ruled by judges and things like that, and Samuel was the last of the great judges. Saul and Samuel and David, these are contemporaries. Okay, Solomon came later on. And so Saul was considered a king, the first king of quote unquote the south. Okay. Again, there are many disputes to this as well. A lot of scholars say that David united the monarchy. But I know there are also some scholars who say that no, it was already united. But that is not what actually the book says. So we have to follow what the book says for argument's sake. And so, which is why it is very difficult, because there's a lot of different interpretations, and it is difficult to actually relay what scholars actually say, because in areas that scholars themselves disagree, it's very hard for the layman to adopt an opinion, because which one is the more true. And so when I was researching about this, you always have to go back to the scripture. You always have, because there are a lot of scholars out there, academic scholars, who give their own interpretation, but they never actually show you how they got it. Meaning they just interpret it, things like that. But use the scholars that actually show you how it's done, because mostly they will cite scripture, different passages, and things like that. And so Saul was the first king, And Samuel anoints David, or God anoints David, um, while he was a young man, and while Saul was still alive. And the reign of Saul comes with him a lot of problems, and so David eventually, Saul lost, he died in battle, and so David became the king. Okay, now David united the monarchy between the south, which is Judah, and the north, which is Israel. The capital of the north was Assyria, and the capital of the south was obviously Jerusalem. And so David united the south and the north. Now, I will not go into the problems of Davidic rule, because I do not believe that these are actually real history. But a lot of scholars believe that they do, because the Quran portrays that all prophets are actually great and noble people. They don't do things that the Hebrew scriptures say that David and Solomon did. Okay, which is why I will not mention them, and also because it is Ramadan. But even outside of Ramadan, I will not mention it, because I don't take this as stories that true. And so when David, David got into a fight with his son, his first son, and so his first son tried to kill David, and so David had to flee to Jerusalem. Okay, David had to flee to Jerusalem. Now David was in the north. Okay, this is all happening in the north. And so when David and his son met in the battlefield, his son died. And so that is how the south and the north became a united monarchy. Okay. Now, Solomon became the successor of David, and David told Solomon what he should do and who he should kill and things like that. Again, he should be careful of, so on and so forth. And so Solomon became the successor of David. This was still during the United Monarchy. Now, the Deuteronomistic historian portrays Solomon as being, quote unquote, a bad person, okay, when it comes to his personal life. But he was a great king, because the Amalekites, even the Egyptians, they all paid tribute to Solomon. Okay. And according to scholars, we do have reports of this in the New Kingdom, or the late Middle Kingdom, that the pharaohs were actually subjected to the ancient Canaanites' land, which is Palestine, Israel today. And so a lot of scholars believe that this actually is historical. Both David and Solomon, reigning around, David was probably 1,000, and Solomon was probably around 9th century BCE or so. So around 800s or 900s BCE. And so we do have inscriptions like this, and so we know that a lot of these lands, they pay tribute to Solomon's kingdom. Okay. And there are some historians who say that both David and Solomon, they do not have a massive kingdoms, but they're just chieftains. Okay. But then again, I reject those opinions because those are minority opinion. But the Deuteronomistic historian portrays the reason why the north and south divided again. Okay, the people in the north rebelled against the people in the south, against Solomon in the south. And around this time, Solomon had built the temple of Solomon. Okay, the Jerusalem temple. David wanted to build the house of God, house for Yahweh, but he wasn't allowed. Again, there are many different reasons why, but according to one interpretation, scholarly interpretation, Barnum mentioned in his introduction to the Bible that probably this is something that later Deuteronomistic historians used to explain, and that because God had not allowed David to build a temple for him, and that he wanted Solomon instead to build a temple for him. Because if you look at it, David is a great king, and what is stopping him from not building a temple for God? And so this is how the Deuteronomistic historian explained that God had actually planned that Solomon to build the temple for God, yeah, and it wasn't David. So that is why the temple is called a Temple of Solomon, and not Temple of David, because David never built any temple. Okay. The Temple of Solomon, Solomon built the temple, but according to the Deuteronomistic historian, the reason why the south and the north became a divided place again, they're not united anymore, because Solomon was engaging in different, I'll just use idolatrous activities. Okay, I don't believe that Solomon was an idolatry, but according to the Deuteronomistic historian, he listened to his wives. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines, by the way, according to the Hebrew text. I don't believe he has this again. And so Solomon was portrayed as promiscuous. He built a temple for Baal, okay, the Canaanite deity Baal. And then he allowed his wife to worship Baal, things like that. He built a temple for Baal, for Baal. Again, I reject all this. The Quran rejects this as well, because the Quran portrays that all prophets, they engage in monotheism. And so the Deuteronomistic historians use this as a reason as to why the south and the north split, because God was angry with Solomon. And then later on in 722, the Assyrians came, and the north was decimated. Okay, and then that is also pretty much after the split and after the death of Solomon. We have the prophet Elijah and Elisha, and as well as the prophet Amos prophesying in the north, and the prophet Isaiah prophesying in the south. Amos and Isaiah, Amos of Tekoa and Isaiah of Jerusalem, they're contemporary with one another. Probably Malachi as well. But anyway, that is for a different video. So I hope this video summarizes I think the most important books, if not one of the most important books of the Hebrew Bible, because that gives you a historical context, okay, as to how it all started for Israel, okay, the children of Israel. Obviously, we can date this back to Moses, but the reason why I did not start with Moses and Joshua as the main theme is because a lot of scholars and academics reject that both Moses and Joshua were historical people anyway. Okay, I believe they exist, but then again, if you were to take it from an academic perspective, a lot of scholars reject that Moses and Joshua were actually real historical people. Whereas when it comes to David and Solomon, especially David, we do have inscriptions that says that dates back to around the year 900 BCE. And so David is definitely a historical person. But then again, which is why some scholars say that he's basically a chieftain. But again, I reject that he's a chieftain. He's probably a great king. No doubt he is a great king. And no doubt he united the monarchy. And this is the opinion of majority of scholars as well. But just to provide you an insight into the scholarship of the ancient Jewish history, there's a lot of different opinions. Yeah, a lot of different opinions. Scholars that strictly adopt the historical approach and who strictly rejects prophecy shed light on a different scale. Whereas scholars that accept prophecy and also accept historical criticism again shed light from different angle, different perspective, a different scale. And theological scholars who strictly adopt evangelical approach, again they gave a different interpretation. And so there's a lot of disagreement when it comes to the study of this area. Scholars that accept prophecy reject certain claim made by historians who reject prophecy. And again, historians who strictly approach this from a historical and literary criticism perspective reject the evangelical scholarly view. And so it depends on how you approach it. There is no It depends on how you approach it. There's no, I would say, there's no ultimate consensus to this, because again, the same goes for the study of Christianity. Raymond Brown, if you read his commentary, he wrote it from someone who accept prophecy, because he was a Catholic priest after all. Different if you read commentaries by scholars who actually reject prophecy. They have to find a literal reason. They have to find evidence that is tangible. They have to find evidence that is not beyond the supernatural. Okay, that is not beyond the natural. They have to find a naturalistic explanation. Whereas scholars who accept prophecy, they can open up another realm, and they can do a supernaturalistic interpretation of a particular text. And that is the approach that I accept, because I do not reject prophecy. Because the study of Christianity, for example, and this is just my own theological take on this, the study of ancient scripture or religion, like Christianity, for example, okay, and Judaism, you have to adopt the premise of the study. Obviously, if you study about prophets and religion, it is beyond the realm of the naturalistic purview, for example. You have to engage in the supernatural. And so you have to apply a supernatural, you have to accept prophecy. Because why would you study about the prophets if you don't accept prophecy? Because the main duty of a prophet was to prophesy. They predict, okay? And you are dealing with God and angels and things like that. These are all things that are hidden. And so this is, for me, scholars that reject prophecy, they are not being fair to the field of study, because if I apply prophecy to the study of medicine, for example, I'm not using the right tools to study that particular subject, and so my conclusions will definitely be a mistake. And the same, if you reject prophecy and you use your methods to study a particular religion, you are not actually applying the right methodology or the right tools to study that particular topic. Again, the argument for that is because that you cannot see prophecy, or you cannot see God. Okay, God prophecies are all beyond all in the realm of the supernatural. And so because it is not something that you can repeat in a test tube, for example, therefore it doesn't exist. Okay, and these are the opinions that some scholars adopt, and I reject those opinions vehemently, and I think they are mistaken, and I think they're not using the right tools to study a particular topic, for example, Christianity. And so I adopt Raymond Brown's opinion more compared to a lot of different scholars. a lot of modern scholars today. So I hope that is clear, and I'll see you on my next video. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.